You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Tyler Orton.
And I'm Romila Barryman.
Well, earlier this week, the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy Canada revealed new numbers regarding the rate of insolvencies across the country.
With us today on the show over phone is to discuss the problems Canadians face when paying their bills is Jeffrey Schwartz. He's the Executive Director at Consolidated Credit Canada. I want to thank you for joining us on the show today, Jeffrey.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, of course, when we see the province by province numbers, that's of particular interest. But I think we want to all know how BC stacks up. But first, what are the trends looking like on a national level? What's the big scope here?
Well, I think you almost have to break it down province by province. But overall, we're seeing that bankruptcies are increasing a little bit, relatively flat, but they're increasing a little bit overall. And when I say bankruptcies, I shouldn't say that. I should actually term it as insolvencies, because there's kind of two levels. There's bankruptcy and consumer proposals.
Well, let's break that down a little bit just to explain to readers what the difference is here.
Well, a consumer proposal is where a consumer will make a proposal to their creditors to pay back somewhat less of the outstanding balance that they have owed to the creditors, whereas a bankruptcy is it's deemed that your creditors will do better if you go totally bankrupt and have all the debt forgiven.
And you had noticed that, we may want to have the idea of breaking it down province by province. So let's start off with British Columbia. How do we stack up versus the rest of the country?
Well, as you might expect, judging from the economics that's going on across the country, that British Columbia is doing pretty well. Overall, I think they showed a 0.1% increase in insolvencies on the consumer side, but you've got cities like Kelowna, Abbotsford, and Vancouver and Victoria, they're all down. So they're showing less in terms of insolvencies. And that's a good thing.
And is that something that we typically see when it comes to BC and insolvencies?
I think it's just a function of what you guys are going through right now. You've got a red hot housing market, and if people did need to fund what they're doing in terms of their spending and their lifestyle, they can often dip into their house to get that equity as it's continuing to rise. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not sure that it's the best thing in terms of financial management, but at least it's available to them. Whereas other people, they're seeing an actual decrease in some of their asset values, and they can't dip into them to cover their lifestyle habits.
Well, I want to seize upon something you just said that, maybe this reflects what's going on, locally here with, of course, our real estate market. But what about other jurisdictions? I look at the numbers for Alberta. Can you break that down for us? Because we all know that Alberta is going through a tough time economically.
You know what? It's almost like they've had the perfect storm there, and I feel so bad for the people there. Between the Fort McMurray and what's going on in the oil patch, their consumers there are really starting to suffer, and this has been going on for quite some time. But it's almost like it's hitting a head right now, because we're seeing that their insolvencies have increased to the tune of 27.5%. So that's a market difference compared to British Columbia, which is relatively flat. And when you look at that, it's almost like saying, okay, well, if I look out on my street, 1 in 4 people, or 1 in 4 of my neighbors, is insolvent, and that's not necessarily a good feeling to have.
Well, I look at the numbers here, and I can't help but notice that a lot of the provinces that are struggling, we just talked about Alberta, also Newfoundland as well. We know all the troubles they're going through. They also seem to have higher insolvency rates. Are these two concepts connected? Depending on how an economy is doing, that often reflects on how consumer debt is doing as well.
Yeah, I think we've got to take a step back and say, well, why are they suffering? And it's likely because of what's going on in the oil patch. Alberta is heavily dependent upon that, and in large part, so is Newfoundland, from the standpoint that a lot of people, when they were out of work in Newfoundland, went over to Alberta to get jobs and worked in the oil patch there. And now they're going back home and they're having trouble managing their finances, and we're seeing some of the issues as a result of it.
Well, I don't want to be, just a real downer here, but are there any provinces that are actually doing quite well? You mentioned BC is actually faring quite well, and if you break it down locally, Vancouver and Victoria as well. But what are some of the stronger provinces? Are there any declines going on throughout the country?
Well, Ontario is actually doing okay. If I'm not mistaken, they decreased by almost 2% overall. I mean, Yukon, there aren't a ton of bankruptcies there. So when it says that the decrease has gone down 4.9%, there isn't a ton of data to kind of rely on at that point. Nova Scotia is relatively flat as well. I think they went down about 0.2% on the consumer insolvency side.
Well,
So there are provinces that are doing okay.
We've talked a little bit about the decline and the reasons for that. The factors include, of course, the resource sector. What are we looking at when we're talking about the increase here? Provinces that are doing well, what factors are involved with that? Particularly Ontario, since you mentioned that as well.
Well, I think there are certain segments of the economy, and I'm not an economist, but there's certain segments of the economy that are doing well. And part of that is through job creation, and also with exports. I mean, I think you mentioned it in a previous segment that with the dollar at where it is right now, people that are exporting are doing well. They're doing better than they have in the most recent past. Also, there's an opportunity for tourism in these places as well. So Vancouver, BC, these are attractive places for tourism. And even Toronto and on some areas of Ontario, they're going to attract people. But there's increase in jobs as well, whether it's the technical side or the health service side. We are seeing some growth in employment in those areas. So that's also going to help the local economies.
And do we know who particularly is the demographic here when it comes to the rate of insolvencies? What's that looking like?
You know, I'd have to dig further into the stats on that. I don't have that right available with me, but there definitely is going to be some segmentation as to who's going bankrupt at what age group. I know that in the last little while, people have been more concerned with seniors going the insolvency route, and that's because perhaps that they didn't save enough. And that's an indicator for the country as a whole, where I'm particularly concerned with is that Canadians aren't saving at the rate they probably should. And whether that means paying off debt before they go into retirement, or it just means to create an emergency fund for themselves just in case of job loss or income reduction so that they don't have to go further into debt to handle that emergency.
That's Jeffrey Schwartz. He's the executive director at Consolidated Credit Canada. We're talking about the rate of insolvencies across the country. Jeffrey, you brought up a really interesting point here in terms of Canadians saving. Let's stick to that topic of consumers here. As of this week, all of the big banks are offering Apple Pay. Do mobile payments make it harder for consumers to judge how much they're spending? How does spending come into play here when we're talking about the insolvency rates?
Well, I'm with you on that comment. And you also had some comments around our smartphones in a previous segment too. I mean, Canadians love to be the first adopters. They love their technology. They love to get involved in what's new and different. And digital payments is just one of those things. But we have to be concerned that there's a potential downside for that as well. And that's taking that break, that mental break around making the purchase. So if you're walking by that coffee store and you say, I really feel like a coffee, and it's as easy as just putting my phone under a scanner and we're done. They might need to think twice about that, especially if they're carrying a tremendous amount of debt, and that's not the best fiscal move that they can make. And so to your point, it's almost too easy to make purchases, and we need to find a way to control how much we're spending so that we budget for those digital purchases so that we don't end up further and further into debt at the end of the month when we say, oh my gosh, I spent that much. I can't believe it. Now how am I going to pay for it?
Well, what are some ways that we can avoid this kind of spending creep, if you will? You don't want to get your bill at the end of the month and realize it's way over your budget. So what are some ways that you would advise consumers to actually avoid this?
Well, first off, get involved with your financial picture. I mean, too many people or too many Canadians don't have a budget, and that's the best place to start, is create a snapshot of what your finances look like, how much you have coming in, how much do you have going out, and then that's going to give you an indication of how much you have to spend. Something simple is leave your credit card at home or limit what you can spend on your credit card through mobile purchases or otherwise throughout the month, and if you hit the 17th of the month and you've got no more to spend, then you don't spend anymore. So it's really all about living within your means. And if you need to go as drastic as just using cash, then that might be the best way as well. Once the cash is gone, no more. The other thing is once you get in trouble, try and avoid the more expensive ways to get out of that trouble, and that's the short-term payday loans, because once you get into those, they can be rather expensive, and you can spiral downward fairly rapidly. Now, I mentioned living within your means. One of the things that we really encourage people to do is to create some sort of emergency savings fund. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, Canadians are percent. I mean, that number was as high in the 80s as almost 20%. So you can imagine that if we're only saving a little bit and we do have an emergency or an unexpected expense, we're going to have to take on debt to do that. So we really encourage Canadians to create an emergency savings fund of, say, 3 to 6 months of expenses.
Well,
but the other thing
that
I recommend, go ahead. I mean, the last thing I really want to recommend, if you're in too deep and you don't know how to get out, seek help. I mean, whether it's a trusted advisor, a wise friend, I mean, that's what to do.
Mm-hmm. We're just losing you there in the last minute, Jeffrey, but really want to thank you for being on the show. Great insight in terms of insolvency rates happening here across the country in Canada.
Pleasure.
Well, that was Jeffrey Schwartz. He's the Executive Director of Consolidated Credit Canada. And you're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Tyler Orton.
And I'm